And good morning and welcome. My name is Dr. Colin King. I am currently the chair of the Equalities and Equities Committee. I'm really delighted that we put together a very basic introduction to equality and diversity to get you to understand two things as outlined on the agenda on the left hand side. Some of the surveys we've done that looking at how people understand the issues around equality and what they want to learn. Secondly, we're going to look at why it's important as part of our governance system. And this first section is just module one, a basic understanding of the awareness of equality. Why was it introduced? What you will learn in this section, and we hope you enjoy it, will be some icebreakers. What does the Equality Act tell us that we have to do as an organisation, and your individual responsibility as committee members? To begin to understand things around bias that we're not aware of, that are unconscious, that we need to begin to look at about how it affects our work and how can we improve our understanding of the diverse communities that we work with in Middlesex. We'll be looking at something called protective characteristics, which are things around sexuality, race and ethnicity. And then at the end, we'll be just looking at some data about how can we actually use data to improve the way we actually work. So what we asked individual people was, what is it they want to learn? And we spoke to our board members and then we spoke to our staff group. And you can begin to see here what they wanted to know about was the legislation, the terms, and how it links to their roles. So as committee members from a variety of different committees, maybe you need to really think about what is it I need to improve. And at the end, we're going to ask you that so we can make it much more person-centered and specific to what you want to learn for yourself and for your committee. So it's quite important for people to get to understand why EDI, which is Equality, Diversity, Inclusion, is quite important. The Mixed FA have been told by the FA that it's a central part of its governance. How we run the organisation needs to be embedded with these three ideas to make sure it's equal, we are diverse, and everybody has a chance to be inclusive, as we see by this brilliant visualisation of disabled football. We can see on the left-hand side, diversity inclusion is that every football county needs to publish their plans about how they're going to achieve equality, diversity and inclusion, which is called a diet plan. And one example, which will give you the diet plan at the end of this presentation, is that you're looking for a good balance of people being represented in communities, better involvement from all range of diverse groups. So we're working towards our diversity codes, our practices, our leadership and diversity targets. And it's really important you give us feedback about how we achieve that. One of the recommendations of the governance is that we address things that may have been unequal in the past, that have led to people being historically underrepresented. One example could be Black and Asian and minority ethnic groups. Maybe that's not the right term that you would use, and people with disabilities. But how do we gradually work towards realistic targets that are an essential part of our governance and our strategy, which is now being put into place for 2024 to 2028. So in this part of the presentation, we just want you to begin to understand what the aims of the learning is and what you should begin to understand as we move towards implementing equality and diversity in all aspects of our work. So you can see the aims of the learning here for Module 1 is the Equality Act that came in 2010. We'll be looking at what unconscious bias actually means and giving you some examples and giving you some scenarios which you can begin to reflect on your own practice. So why was it introduced? How does it operate in our work? or in football. And then we'll be talking in more detail protective characteristics. These are characteristics around disability, ethnicity, gender, and we'll go through that in an order. If I'm going too fast, please go back to this and just listen to it again. I do have a kind of intent to actually ramble. But we'll be also looking at why inclusion, diversity, equality, and purpose. This section here is that I may just give an example of some notes that may be useful for you while you're learning, when you can take this away and record it. So as we mentioned, this is the first of two modules, understanding and developing an awareness. As mentioned, we're going to go through some learning points for use, unconscious bias we've mentioned, but we're going to feature a bit more this difference between what is inclusion, what is equality, and what is equity, and how does that influence the way we then implement the different 9 characteristics as part of the Equality Act. And we'll be looking at how these issues of equality and equity features part of our plan for the future, and how we work with the staff members who are implementing and delivering this work. So in this first icebreaker, we're just going to ask you a few questions, and I'll give you an example about what you may think about. So it's getting an understanding about what is your life and how do you begin to understand things. So the country you were born in, and I would put England, and then I would put the town, I would say London. Then it asks me my favourite colour. Oh, that's difficult. I say black. Then it asks me, name your 5 best friends and where they're from. Well, my best friends, I'm not going to put them in, but they're all from London. And lastly, what communities are you less likely to spend around? So I would say in my work, I'm less likely to spend around people with disability. So I'm just thinking about how what's going to be the challenge for me to understand the area. And home, I would say, I'm less likely to spend times around maybe faith groups. So I'm now thinking as an icebreaker, this is Colin, and these are some of the things that I understand about my life outside of football and the people that may influence my understanding of equality, diversity, and inclusion. Now we begin to understand who we are and what influences our life. We need to then understand, so what is equality and why is it important? So it is an act of parliament, so it is a legal framework that challenges and makes sure we are moving towards anti-discrimination. We do not discriminate, and it protects people from discrimination within the workplace, in football, and wider society. So as you can see below, discrimination is defined as a person discriminates against another because of a protective characteristic, and it may lead to people being treated more favourably than other people. But diversity is the practice, it's the things we actually do to ensure that we introduce the equality that leads to different people from a range of different backgrounds being treated with equality, and ensure that we do not discriminate. And we'll go through some of this later on. So if you want to then use your notes at the side to say, what have I learned here, or what I've not learned, I'm still not clear maybe about equity. So this helps me understand what we need to do to improve our understanding of that area. So in this first section, before we get into the legislation, we need to think about ourselves and how we understand, how we respond to people, and how we actually improve the way we work to make sure we are anti-discriminatory. The picture is a picture of a few kids, someone's watching the background, and so we ask you, so In what ways have different communities been important in your life? And you can use this diagram, we'll give you some clips, or you can simply say certain communities have been important in my life. So I need to think, what communities do I actually are important in my life? So I would say black communities in terms of my life and my family. In terms of I worked with lots of people from diverse areas. And in football, people that have been really important in my life. And I think about these communities, and I'm finding that difficult. So I'm just going to come back to that because I really need to understand what this question is actually about and what is unconscious bias. So now I'm thinking about things. I'm thinking, what's the things I've actually not really began to address that are unconscious that I've got to make conscious? So I'm going to come back to that. And I've got a few answers that I can actually work on another time. So in the section before, I begin to understand, what is unconscious bias? And now I get a definition. So let me read this definition. The groups of people and individuals that form an understanding of things I haven't thought about. Everyone holds this. Sometimes we're not even aware of it. That's why it's unconscious. And sometimes it's about social and groups and identity. And it's about how we then make sense of the world that we live in. So this is now asking me to think again in a bit more depth. There's two areas where in your life where you may happen. So unconscious bias, there's two areas in your life where it may happen. Two areas in my life it may happen. So I'm just thinking maybe in my coaching, I often pick people who have the same values. Yeah, is that correct? So I'm thinking about that. Have the same values or pick people who think like me. So let me think about another area where I think unconscious bias takes them. And maybe I can think about areas where I don't pick people. I often don't pick people who are disabled because so I've got to think about that. So I'm now getting into this unconscious bias and where it happens. So I've listed two items, and this is maybe two areas that I have to work with that's affecting or influence how I work in football. So in this section, I'm getting a bit more idea from the words on the left and the picture on the right that unconscious bias is based upon all these different things, preferences, something that is about behavior and it's decision making, and it can lead to working with certain groups because of our beliefs. And the picture on the left, some of the perceptions that we make about people who are disabled rather than seeing the person. And so this is now asking me to pick one word and define it, and I'm finding this really difficult to do. So I'm just going to say judgment. And I think judgment for me is a false belief that leads to making an assessment without evidence. That sounded long, didn't it? So I'm now beginning to find out, this is where I'm actually unconscious. This is where it comes out as a judgment, and I'm now defining why I think it's useful. So in this section, we're showing you a picture, and you can look at the picture because we're going to ask you some questions later on, because we need to get you to begin to understand what is protected, that's something we've got to look after, and what is a characteristic, that's something that people actually have. And the definition here provided by the Equality Act under Section 4 is understanding what particular characteristics are, why they're important, because it can lead to people being discriminated against, experiencing harassment, and it's unlawful because it's protected. That means we need to protect people who have certain characteristics. And we're going to go that in a bit more detail. So in this section, you may want to take 5 minutes outlining the purpose and definition of how it links to the work in which we do. But having a protected character means you have a right not to be treated. This is very important, to be treated less favourably. But we may do the unconscious. That's why we actually look at how do we make those things conscious. Because it can lead to people being unfairly disadvantaged by that characteristic. And we'll go into a bit more detail about what these are in terms of race, age, religion, sex, and sexual orientation. So let's begin to list this, and there will be a video for you to begin to understand what these characteristics actually mean. And so from the top left-hand corner, we've got age going through to sexual orientation. We would present you with cards, but we could ask you this. After watching the video and then checking your responses, right, put them in order of what you know about the terms. What do I know about the terms in order? And I would say I know about race. That's something I know quite well on, I think. And then I look at, I think I know about religion. I think that's in order of what I actually know. And then I'm going to say, having listened to the video and looking at the cards, I'm going to put, I think, disability. I'm not going to go through all of them, but it gives you an idea to check your understanding and maybe go back to the tape and then begin to listen in more details. The things I would put down at the bottom, I think, if I was really honest with myself, would be gender reassignment and marriage and civil partnership. So there's a kind of pattern there about the things I'm not good at understanding. And then I need to go back to the tape. So we're beginning to understand what is it, what you know about it, and then what you need to improve your learning. Oh, hi. So in this section, we're going to link unconscious understanding to what we know as protected characteristics to how we see it operated inside football. So the exercise, which you can use by a simple list, which I'm showing you now, the question is what we know and what we see. How many statistic characteristics do we see? Yeah. So if I just start looking at the first one, I would say, I think that's about race in the first picture. And then I go and I think, then we've got gender in this picture here. And I think in this next picture, it's gender again. Then I begin to look at this picture, it's race. And then I look at this picture here, I think it's age. But what makes it quite challenging when you're working in football, that people have more than one characteristic. I've also going back now and I see in this picture disability. So I'm looking at my unconscious bias, but how many are linked? So for example, this picture here could be disability, race, and age. It could also be gender. There's certain things that are very difficult to see. Sexuality, ethnicity we may see, but is it really correct? And also people's faith and religious belief. So that's why it's really important that we develop an understanding for what we think we know, what we understand, and what we actually see in terms of how it operates. Whilst in the past slide we began to understand what is equality, how diverse and are we inclusive, by firstly looking at unconscious bias, relating that to the legislation, and also begin to look visually at what we see. Sometimes the most important thing to address these issues, particularly in terms of equality, making things all equal, but equity is making sure that the pathways are the same for everyone. We need to look at data, which is how many people do we have of different characteristics in our borough? Which part of the organisations are they using or not using? That can be historically or not. And then that will then begin to influence how we then put in a policy and a strategy for the Middlesex FA, including the staff, the boards and the committee, to begin to move towards a gradual, realistic change that addresses some of the challenges that we need to begin to understand. So we're going to look into this a little bit more detail. So linking it to the past presentation, they're going to look at some data, and I find data quite hard to look at. So this is Middlesex FA, just some generic participation numbers. What we haven't got is the census data of 2021. So going through this as I understand, because the question is asking me what's gone wrong and what are the challenges from the data. So if I look at ethnicity and general participation rates, I begin to look at how ethnicity is broken down, and we look at Asian, Black, mixed, and that's a really challenging term. And we look at the numbers. So we look at maybe who are the lowest participation group at the moment, where it seems to me we have maybe a challenge around the Asian and Asian community. So I would be saying, look at my work now, I'll be saying something around Asian communities. But I want to maybe ask a bit more in-depth questions about what areas we're talking about. And then if I go to my next chart, protected characteristic is sexuality, it breaks it down, and you can see some people haven't filled it in, or we haven't got the data. So one of the challenges that we may have is the very low percentage at this moment around people who are bisexual or gay or lesbian. And so the issue for me is that how do we then work with the LGBT communities? And thirdly, we've got to go on to the second draft is religion. And again, we've got the definition. We may say there's religions we've missed out. Rastafarian is not actually there at the moment. And we look at some of the challenges that we have. And the biggest one, it seems to me, is I look at my data in terms of protected characteristics, is Hindu. So the other challenges may be, can I get more specific information? Yep. And the second thing I would say, challenges, looking back what I've learned in the last two slides, is where there is more than one area, which means the links. So I'm thinking about, okay, so how does ethnicity and religion work together? And then we got something on pathways. Just a few examples about you as committee members can think about how I use data to put my plan together to ensure everything's equal, but I'm looking at equity. How do I make sure that all these groups have an equal chance of getting a supportive survey? So welcome to the final part of this presentation. I just want to to ensure that you will be supportive, not just to understand, but beginning to address some of the changes as an organisation, as a committee, as a board and the staff group we need to put in place to make sure we're addressing equality and equity, which has now changed the board. And the reason why it was changed, that we think to really be inclusive and diverse, we need to look at the bigger issues around equality and diversity. So the board was set up to make sure our governance, our board is addressing equality at all aspects of the work, including the challenges for you. So the inclusion advisory board, which is the old name, is advancing equality of opportunities, particularly for groups who historically have not been represented. The group will support everybody within the Middlesex FA family, particularly community groups and football organisations and stakeholders, to develop better relationships. Our ultimate aim, as it says in this last section, is to make sure we begin to eliminate unlawful discrimination, particularly these three areas: bullying, harassment, and victimisation. And what we'll be doing is actually linking this into some of the safeguarding challenges for our welfare and support of our communities. Thank you for completing this, and you can go back and look at some of the sections. Next stages, I would say, will be Module 2, which we'll be devising. We'll be actually looking at involving community, and thirdly, the 2024-28 MFA strategy. The last thing for you will be what next for yourself and for your committee. In terms of your committee, you'll be sent an action form, which is really about what is it you want to achieve in terms of addressing equality and diversity. And then we're going to put that together with all the other committees and the staff to get one big plan, which will be linked. And hopefully from that plan, we can address our DIAB, which is our equality action plans. We are linking up with Kick It Out, and we are moving towards sports charter from the quality department. Please give us any feedback about changing this or things you can contribute, and thank you very much.